I thought the worst thing that could happen was being left. I didn't know that some exits are mercy in disguise. On the morning of my wedding, the man I was supposed to marry disappeared. No vows. No explanation. Just silence where promises had been. What followed wasn't chaos. It was peace. And that's how I knew something deeper had been wrong long before he left. This isn't a story about heartbreak. It's a story about interruption. Welcome to Threads of Grace. My name is Amani, and this is my story. I woke up before my alarm in a house that wasn't mine. The guest room smelled faintly of lavender and detergent, my friend Nyla's attempt to make me feel at home during the last stretch before the wedding. My dress hung in the corner, zipped and waiting, like it had been holding its breath all night. For a few seconds, I forgot what day it was. Then the quiet reminded me. It was too still. Not the gentle quiet of rest, but the kind that waits. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening for something. Anything that would tell me this day had officially begun. My phone lay face down on the nightstand. No missed calls. No messages. I turned it over. 5:39 a.m. I should have already heard from Eli. He always texted first on important days. Good morning, future Mrs. with a smiley face he pretended to hate. I told myself he was praying. He liked to be alone with God when he was nervous. That explanation slid into place too easily. I sat up, my feet touching the cold floor, and waited for my body to react. For the rush of panic I had been warned about. For the fluttering joy I was supposed to feel. For fear, at least. Nothing. My heart beat steadily, like it didn't know it was meant to be part of something monumental today. I pressed my palm against my chest, almost accusingly. Feel something, I thought. Still nothing. I reached for my phone and typed his name. The cursor blinked in the message box. Patient, expectant. I stared at it longer than necessary before locking the screen again. I didn't want to be the one to reach first. That truth unsettled me. Last night, Nyla had hugged me in the hallway and said, "You're so calm." I'd be a wreck. I had smiled and said something about trusting God. What I hadn't said was that calm had stopped feeling like a gift weeks ago. It felt more like my emotions had packed up and left quietly, the way guests do when they realize they've overstayed their welcome. I slipped out of bed and padded into the kitchen. Nyla's house was still asleep. A sticky note waited on the counter in her handwriting. "I'll be up by 6. Love you." I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly, watching the clock on the microwave tick forward. 5:52, 5:56, 6:01. My phone remained silent. That was when it buzzed. My breath caught. Not sharp, not dramatic, just enough to remind me I was still capable of reaction. I grabbed it too quickly. Not Eli. An email notification. Subject, for Amani. My fingers went cold. The sender was his name. I didn't open it right away. I sat at the small kitchen table, phone in my hands, elbows resting on the surface like I needed the support. Somewhere down the hall, Nyla shifted in her sleep. The world felt fragile, like one wrong movement would shatter it. When I finally opened the email, the words were careful, polished, familiar. "I've been praying all night, and I don't have peace about today." I read the sentence twice, then again, as if repetition might soften it. He wrote about discernment, about obedience, about not wanting to step outside God's will. Scripture dotted the message like insulation, padding the blow. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't explain where he was now, in the early hours of a morning that was supposed to change both our lives. By the time I finished reading, my hands had stopped trembling, because I realized they hadn't been trembling at all. What rose in my chest wasn't heartbreak. It was space, an unsettling absence of pressure. Like a weight I hadn't admitted was there had suddenly been lifted, and my body was confused by the freedom. A thought came then, unwanted and merciless. If he hadn't sent this email, I would have gone to the ceremony anyway. I would have smiled. I would have said yes. I would have called it faith. That realization lodged itself somewhere deep and sharp. Nyla's alarm went off down the hall. In a few minutes, she would wake up and come find me. There would be questions, panic, damage control. People would cry for me, pray over me, tell me this was an attack, a test, a mystery. I stared at my phone and felt something darker than grief settle in. The wedding wasn't happening, and the most frightening part wasn't that he had disappeared. It was that a part of me had been waiting for permission to stop pretending this was peace. Nyla found me at the kitchen table with my phone in my hands and my eyes fixed on nothing. She didn't ask what was wrong at first. She just stood there in the doorway, still wrapped in sleep and confusion, watching me like someone watches a pot they're afraid might boil over. "Amani," she said softly. I looked up at her. My mouth opened, closed. I tried again. "He's not coming." The words landed between us and stayed there. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps and took the phone from my hands without asking. I let her. I watched her face change as she read, brows knitting, jaw tightening, the slow rise of disbelief giving way to anger. "This is it," she said. "This is what he sent." I nodded. "On email." Her voice sharpened. "On your wedding morning?" I shrugged, which felt wrong. People expect grief to be dramatic. Mine felt like a locked door. Nyla swore under her breath and set the phone down. "Okay," she said too quickly. "Okay, we'll call him. Maybe his phone's off. Maybe he panicked. Men do that." I didn't stop her. She dialed once. Twice. Voicemail. She tried again. Same result. Her shoulders stiffened. She turned to me. "I'm calling Pastor Samuel." The room seemed to tilt. "No," I said. The word came out firmer than I expected. She paused. "What?" "Not yet." Nyla stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "Amani, this is serious." "I know. But what I didn't say was this. If too many people got involved too quickly, the story would stop being mine." Nyla exhaled hard and rubbed her temples. "Your mother is already on her way." That landed harder than Eli's email. I nodded again. My body still hadn't caught up to the moment. I felt like a witness to my own life, watching events unfold without permission to interfere. The first call came at 6:27, then another, then 3 more. I let them ring. By the time my mother arrived, fully dressed and radiant in a way that felt cruelly intentional, the house was no longer quiet. Phones buzzed constantly. Messages stacked. Questions multiplied. "Where is he?" she asked the moment she saw me. I handed her my phone. She read the email once. Then again. Her mouth tightened, and for a second I thought she might cry. Instead, she lifted her head. "We will not embarrass ourselves," she said. The word ourselves echoed in my chest. She began pacing, already making decisions. "We'll say there's been a delay. A spiritual delay. People will understand. The church will understand." "Mom," I said quietly. She stopped and turned to me. "This is not the time to fall apart." I realized then that she hadn't once asked how I felt. My aunt called. Then a bridesmaid. Then someone from the church who should not have known yet. By 7:15, the story was no longer contained. By 7:30, it had a shape. Eli was being attacked. The enemy was confusing things. Prayer was needed urgently. No one said the word abandoned. Someone suggested we pray together in the living room. I knelt because everyone else did. Hands pressed against my shoulders, my back, my hair. Voices rose around me, urgent and loud, asking God to restore, to rebuke, to return. I closed my eyes. All I felt was pressure. And beneath it, a memory I hadn't allowed myself to touch until now. The night, weeks earlier, when I had asked Eli a simple question. "Is there anything you've never told me?" He had smiled, kissed my forehead, said, "Why would you ask that?" I hadn't answered. I hadn't asked again. The prayer around me grew louder. Someone began to cry. That was when it hit me, not all at once, but slowly, like a bruise surfacing. If he came back now, everyone would expect me to accept him, to call it victory, to call it faith. The thought made my stomach turn. I opened my eyes. For the first time that morning, fear finally found me. Not fear of losing him. Fear of being convinced to take him back before I ever learned the truth. And somewhere, far away, but moving closer, I sensed that silence was no longer his only secret. By mid-morning, Nyla's house felt like a waiting room where no one knew what they were waiting for. People kept arriving anyway. My mother's sisters came first, their perfume heavy and clashing, arms already open for consolation. They seemed eager to perform. They hugged me tightly, murmuring things that sounded holy but felt rehearsed. "God is in control. This is not the end. He will come back." Each sentence landed on me like a command. I nodded. I smiled when required. I learned quickly that silence made people uncomfortable, so I offered them small expressions, enough to reassure them that I was still behaving correctly. Inside, something in me was folding in on itself. The dress still hung in the corner of the guest room. No one suggested moving it. It was easier to pretend it was still relevant, that this moment was temporary. A pause. A test. A delay. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror as I passed. Hair still wrapped. Face bare, eyes steady. I looked like a woman preparing for something important. I wondered if this was how denial worked. Quiet, polite, fully dressed. At 10:11 a.m., my phone buzzed again. Not Eli. A message from one of the bridesmaids. People are asking questions. What should we say? I stared at the screen until the words blurred. What should we say? As if this were a group project. As if the truth were something we could edit. I typed, then erased. Typed again. I don't know yet. The dots appeared almost immediately. We're praying for you. Don't let the enemy win. I locked the phone. In the living room, my aunt had taken control of the conversation. She spoke in low, urgent tones about reputation, about how quickly stories spread, about the danger of letting the wrong version take root. We must be careful, she said. This kind of thing can stain a woman. A woman, not a man who disappeared, not a choice he made. A woman. I felt something sharp flicker in my chest. Not anger yet, but recognition. I had heard this language before, growing up. The unspoken rules. The warnings disguised as wisdom. Endure. Be patient. Cover him. Someone suggested fasting. Someone else suggested sending elders to Eli's apartment to check on him. The idea of strangers knocking on his door made my skin crawl, not because I wanted to protect him, but because I didn't want him dragged back by obligation. That thought startled me. Why didn't I want him forced to return? The answer came too easily. Because if he came back like that, ashamed, cornered, repentant, I would be expected to forgive immediately. Publicly. Beautifully. Without questions. Forgiveness, I was learning, was often demanded before truth. I slipped back into the guest room and closed the door. The quiet inside felt different now. Thicker, heavier, like it was holding something in. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the dress. Just yesterday, I had stood in front of that same mirror and asked myself if this was what obedience felt like. I had pressed the thought down, the way I always did, and told myself love wasn't supposed to feel easy. Now, with no one watching, I let myself think the thought I had avoided for months. What if I didn't trust him? Not because I had proof, but because my body had learned to go still around him. I remembered moments I had brushed off. The way he deflected personal questions with jokes. How every conflict ended with scripture instead of resolution. How I always felt like I was being examined, weighed, approved. I had called that safety. But sitting alone in that room, I realized something unsettling. I felt safer now. That realization made my throat tighten, not with grief, but with guilt. What kind of woman feels safer after being left? A knock sounded at the door. Amani. Nyla's voice, careful. Your mom wants to talk. I stood slowly. My legs felt steady. That scared me too. When I returned to the living room, the conversation stopped. All eyes turned toward me, searching my face for cues. My mother reached for my hands. We need to decide our next steps, she said gently. People are confused. I nodded. What do you want to do? Nyla asked quietly from the corner. The room went very still. No one had asked me that yet. I opened my mouth and closed it again. Because the truth was forming, heavy and dangerous. I didn't want him back today. I wanted to know who he was when no one was watching. And I was suddenly afraid that the reason he ran had less to do with fear, and more to do with what marriage would have forced into the light. I looked around the room at the faces that loved me, managed me, prayed over me. I need time, I said finally. Some of them nodded. Some of them frowned. My mother's smile didn't reach her eyes. Time, I would soon learn, is a threat to carefully protected lies. And Eli had already taken too much of it with him. Memory didn't come to me like a revelation. It came like nausea. Late afternoon found me alone again in the guest room. The house finally quiet after hours of murmured prayers and forced optimism. I lay on Nyla's bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned in lazy, indifferent circles. I told myself I was tired. That was the word I used when I didn't want to admit something heavier was rising. It started with a smell. The faint trace of sandalwood, the kind Eli used to wear, drifted from the open suitcase at the foot of the bed. I must have packed something of his by mistake. The scent hit the back of my throat, and suddenly I wasn't in Nyla's house anymore. I was standing in his apartment. 3 months earlier, I had come over unannounced, something I rarely did. He liked notice, preparation, control, though I never used that word then. He had looked surprised to see me. Not guilty, not flustered, just unsettled. Everything okay? I had asked, already feeling foolish for needing to. Yes, he said too quickly, then smiled. Why wouldn't it be? The memory sharpened. I remembered how his phone had been face down on the counter, how he'd moved it without thinking, how I'd noticed, but said nothing. I squeezed my eyes shut. Another moment surfaced. We were in premarital counseling. Pastor Samuel had asked us about transparency, what it meant to us, where we struggled. Eli had spoken confidently about honesty as a discipline, about accountability structures, and spiritual leadership. I had nodded, but I remembered now how his answers stayed theological. Clean, untouchable, never personal. When it was my turn, I'd said something vague about learning to speak up. The counselor smiled approvingly. No one had asked why I needed to learn that. My chest tightened. I rolled onto my side and pressed my knees to my chest, as if bracing myself. There were other moments. Small ones. The kind you don't tell your friends about, because they sound petty out loud. The time I'd asked about a woman who commented too frequently on his posts, and he'd laughed and said, "You're reading into things." The way arguments ended with him praying instead of apologizing. How he framed my discomfort as anxiety he was patiently enduring. I had called that grace. But memory has a cruel way of changing language. What I'd called grace had required my silence. If this story feels uncomfortably familiar, I need you to hear this. You're not dramatic. You're not faithless. You're not imagining it. All right, back to the SD. Ori. A knock sounded softly at the door. I didn't answer. Another memory rose, uninvited. The night before the wedding. I had stood in his apartment, holding my phone, my heart racing in a way I hadn't named at the time. Is there anything you've never told me? I'd asked. The room had gone still. Not tense. Alert. Eli had smiled and stepped closer, resting his hands on my shoulders like he was grounding me. Why would you ask that now? He'd said gently. This is just pre-wedding nerves. I had felt embarrassed. Childish. Ashamed for disrupting the peace. I apologized. The memory burned. I opened my eyes and stared at the wall, breath shallow. That was the moment, I realized now. Not when he left. Not when the email came. That was when my body had known. The silence after my question. The way his eyes searched my face, not for reassurance, but for damage control. I had chosen not to trust myself. A wave of something hot rose in my chest. Not rage yet, but grief with teeth. Not grief for the man who left. Grief for the woman who had been taught to override her instincts in the name of faith. I sat up slowly. For the first time that day, I felt something clearly. Anger. Not wild. Not loud. Focused. If Eli had run because marriage would have required him to be fully known, then the truth wasn't just hiding in his absence. It had been present in every moment I'd been asked to be smaller. I reached for my phone, heart pounding now for a reason I recognized. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, but I knew this. Whatever he had buried, my remembering was already digging it up. And memory, once awakened, does not stop at permission. I wasn't looking for evidence. That's the lie I tell myself later, when I want to believe I was still innocent, still faithful, still giving him the benefit of the doubt. In truth, something in me had shifted. Memory had opened a door, and now my hands were restless. I needed to touch something solid, something that could not be prayed away or explained into holiness. It started with the suitcase. I had opened it to find a sweater, folded neatly, unmistakably his. I must have borrowed it weeks ago and forgotten to return it. The smell of his cologne clung to the fabric, sharp and grounding. I should have closed the suitcase then. Instead, I kept going. Beneath the sweater was a small leather notebook. Black, worn at the corners. Not mine. My heart stuttered. Eli loved digital everything. Notes, reminders, prayers, all on his phone. He used to joke that handwriting was inefficient. Seeing something physical, something old-fashioned and hidden, sent a chill through me. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The first few pages were harmless. Scripture references, dates, short reflections written in his careful, controlled handwriting. Then the tone changed. Not abruptly, gradually. Like a man relaxing once he believed he was alone. There were names. Not many at first. Initials. Dates beside them. Short phrases I didn't understand yet. Met again. Promised clarity. Prayed together. My mouth went dry. I flipped faster now, pulse pounding. The language became more personal. Less spiritual. Less guarded. She asked if I loved her. Told her this season is complicated. Reminded her to trust God's timing. My hands began to shake. There it was, that familiar phrase. The one he had used with me whenever I pressed too hard. God's timing. A holy pause button. A way to suspend accountability indefinitely. I kept reading. One entry stopped me completely. She said she didn't want to be hidden anymore. The date was 3 weeks before the wedding. I felt something inside me split, not loudly, but cleanly, like a bone breaking without sound. I dropped the notebook onto the bed as if it had burned me. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The room felt too small, my skin too tight, my breathing shallow and fast, like I'd been running without knowing it. This wasn't temptation. This wasn't a stumble. This was a pattern. I picked the notebook back up, slower this time, forcing myself to read what I had avoided the first time. There were apologies written, not to me, but to God. Confessions without names. Repentance without endings. He had been confessing behavior he never intended to stop. I thought of the premarital counseling sessions. The way he spoke so confidently about accountability. The way everyone admired his honesty. The irony made my stomach twist. My phone buzzed. I flinched. A message request from a number I didn't recognize. Hi, I'm not sure if this is appropriate, but are you Amani? My fingers hovered over the screen. I didn't answer immediately. I stared at the notebook in my lap, at the proof that had existed quietly all along, waiting for me to stop looking away. Another message came through. I'm so sorry if this hurts you. I just found out you were supposed to get married today. My throat tightened. I typed back with hands that no longer felt like mine. Yes. Who is this? The typing dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. My name is Ruth. I knew Eli from church. We were involved. He told me he was waiting for clarity before committing to anyone. I closed my eyes. There it was. Not accusation. Not speculation. Confirmation. I asked one more question, even though I already knew the answer. When did this start? The reply came almost immediately. Last year. The room tilted. Last year. I thought of holidays. Family dinners. Engagement photos. Sermons about integrity. Prayers spoken over us. I pressed my hand to my mouth, not to stop a scream, but to hold in something heavier. Grief curdled into clarity. This wasn't about me not being enough. This was about a man who had built a godly image sturdy enough to hide behind while he lived another life entirely. I looked down at the notebook again, at the careful handwriting, at the prayers that never reached me, at the truth he had trusted paper with, but not the woman he was supposed to marry. The peace I'd felt that morning finally made sense. It hadn't been relief. It had been escape. I set the notebook down and stood, my legs steady in a way they hadn't been all day. Outside the guest room, I could hear voices again. My mother, Nyla, people deciding things for me. For the first time, I knew something they didn't. And once truth has weight, it changes the way you stand. I picked up my phone and stared at Ruth's last message. I didn't know about you until yesterday. Neither had I. But I was done being the last person to know. I didn't confront Eli right away. That surprised me. I sat with the truth first, letting it settle into my body the way cold does, slowly, until resistance feels pointless. The notebook lay closed on the bed, quiet now, like it had already done its damage and was waiting for judgment. Voices drifted in from the living room. My name, plans, explanations forming without me. I stood and carried the notebook with me when I left the room. No one noticed it in my hands. They were too busy watching my face. I need to make a call, I said. My mother nodded distractedly. Good. Call Pastor Samuel. No, I said. That got her attention. I'm calling Eli. The room went still in the way rooms do when control shifts and no one wants to acknowledge it. Nyla looked at me carefully. She didn't smile. She didn't interrupt. She just nodded once, like she trusted whatever I was about to do. I stepped outside. The air felt sharp against my skin. Real. Grounding. I hadn't realized how long I'd been holding my breath until then. I dialed his number. It rang once. Twice. Then, Amani. His voice was calm. Too calm. Like he'd been waiting. I'm listening, I said. A pause. A careful inhale. I know this is hard, he began. I cut in. Where are you? Another pause. Longer this time. I needed space. Where? I repeated. Does it matter? It did. But not for the reason he thought. No, I said. And meant it. He exhaled, relieved. I could hear it in the way his voice softened. I'm glad you're taking this well. I was worried you'd. I opened the notebook. The sound of paper moving traveled through the line. Misunderstand, he finished. Who is Ruth? I asked. Silence. Not confusion. Not denial. Recognition. The quiet stretched, thick and unmistakable. I imagined him sitting wherever he was, posture changing, mind recalibrating. I think this conversation would be better in person, he said finally. No, I said again. Say it. Amani. How long? My voice didn't shake. That surprised both of us. Another breath. Controlled. Practiced. It's not what you think. I almost laughed. Almost. How long? I repeated. Last year. There it was. Out loud. No email could soften it now. I waited for something to rise in me. Rage, devastation, collapse. What came instead was stillness. How many? I asked. That's not fair. So more than one. Silence confirmed it. I looked down at the notebook in my hands. You wrote about clarity, I said. About God's timing. You told them the same things you told me. I was struggling, he said quickly. Spiritually. I didn't want to make a permanent decision while I was lying. I finished. He bristled. I could hear it. That's not how I see it. Of course it wasn't. I asked you, I said quietly. I asked you if there was anything you hadn't told me. I didn't want to hurt you. No, I said. You didn't want to be exposed. That one landed. His voice hardened. You're being unfair. I smiled then. Not because it was funny, but because the pattern was complete. You left, I said. Not because you lacked peace, but because marriage would have required honesty. That's not true. You didn't run from commitment, I continued. You ran from being known. He said my name like a warning. I trusted you, I said. And you trusted me to stay quiet. Another pause. This one angry. You're making me the villain, he said. I closed my eyes. No, I replied. You did that yourself. I just stopped helping you hide it. His tone shifted then, subtle, dangerous. You know this doesn't have to go any further. We can handle this privately. Protect each other. There it was. The invitation to collude. To be gracious. To be silent. To be spiritual about betrayal. I looked back through the glass door at the room, full of people waiting to manage me. I won't cover this, I said. He laughed softly. Be careful. You don't want to ruin a good man's reputation over misunderstandings. That was the moment. Not the affairs. Not the lies. That sentence. I'm not ruining anything, I said. I'm just done carrying what you dropped. He went quiet. I didn't wait for a response. I ended the call. My hands were steady as I turned back toward the house. The door reflected my image faintly, tired, barefaced, unmistakably awake. When I stepped inside, every conversation stopped. My mother opened her mouth. I raised the notebook. There won't be a reconciliation, I said. And there won't be a delay. The room inhaled sharply. This wedding is not postponed, I continued. It's canceled. Someone whispered my name. I didn't look at them. I know the truth now, I said. And I will not be pressured into forgiving a lie I was never allowed to question. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the sound of a narrative breaking. And for the first time that day, I understood something with terrifying clarity. Walking away wasn't the hard part. The hard part would be watching how many people preferred the lie to my freedom. No one spoke at first. They just stared at me, at the notebook in my hands, at my face, at the version of me they were trying to reconcile with the one they thought they knew. I felt suddenly exposed, not because I had shared too much, but because I had shared enough. My mother was the first to recover. She reached for the notebook. Amani, let's not make permanent decisions while emotions are high. I pulled it back. This isn't emotion, I said. It's information. Her lips pressed into a thin line. People make mistakes. Yes, I said. Patterns aren't mistakes. That word again. Patterns. It landed poorly. I could tell. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted uncomfortably. The room had lost its script, and without one, people didn't know where to stand. Nyla broke the silence. How long did you know? She asked gently. Today, I said. But I've been not knowing for a long time. She nodded slowly, like that made sense to her even if it didn't to anyone else. My aunt spoke next, her voice careful in the way people get when they're about to say something cruel and want credit for kindness. You don't have to tell anyone, she said. You can protect him. Protect yourself. This doesn't need to define you. There it was. The offer. Privacy dressed up as mercy. Silence offered as wisdom. I felt the old reflex stir, the urge to smooth things over, to shrink the truth until it fit comfortably in other people's hands. But something in me was tired. I'm not interested in protection, I said. I'm interested in reality. That unsettled them. Reality requires witnesses. Reality demands change. My mother sat down heavily on the couch. She looked smaller suddenly, older. Do you know what people will say? She asked quietly. Yes, I said. And I did. They would say I was impatient, that I overreacted, that I let the enemy win, that a good woman endures. They would say a man's failure should not cancel his future. They would forget to ask about mine. I don't need them to understand, I continued. I need them to stop asking me to disappear for his comfort. Silence again. This one stretched. I realized then that I wasn't just sitting in the aftermath of a broken wedding. I was sitting in the ruins of an agreement I'd never consciously made but had lived under anyway. Be agreeable. Be gracious. Be quiet. I excused myself and went back to the guest room, closing the door softly behind me. I sat on the floor, my back against the bed, the notebook resting in my lap. My hands finally began to tremble, not from fear, but from release. My body catching up now that the danger had passed. Tears came then. Not loud, not dramatic. Grief, finally given permission. I cried for the woman I had been becoming without noticing, for the instincts I had silenced, for the life I almost accepted because everyone told me it was holy. I stayed there a long time, long enough for the house to quiet again, long enough for the sun to begin its slow descent, casting the room in amber light. My phone buzzed once. A message from Eli. We need to talk. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. I stared at the screen. Then I turned the phone face down and placed it on the carpet. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to respond. Not because I was strong, but because I was done negotiating with a lie. I lay back on the floor and closed my eyes. The world hadn't ended, but something had. And in the stillness that followed, I understood this much. Truth doesn't rush. It waits. And so would I. The story reached the church before I did. By Sunday morning, it had already been prayed over, edited, softened, and reassigned. I knew this because my phone began to buzz just after sunrise, not with concern, but with interpretations. We're praying for reconciliation. Don't let one mistake steal your future. Covering him would show real maturity. No one asked me what had happened. They told me what it meant. When I walked into church, the sanctuary felt different, like a room that had decided something without you and was waiting to see if you would cooperate. Conversations paused. Smiles hesitated, then returned too brightly. I slid into a seat near the back. Someone touched my shoulder. You're so strong, they whispered. I wondered when strength had become synonymous with silence. The sermon was about forgiveness. Of course it was. The pastor spoke carefully, never mentioning names, never acknowledging the obvious. He talked about restoration, about the danger of pride, about how the enemy loves to isolate believers during moments of offense. Every sentence felt like a suggestion. When the altar call came, heads turned slightly, subtle, practiced. The invitation wasn't spoken, but it hovered in the air. Go forward. Be humble. Let us pray you back into the right story. I stayed seated. After service, the questions came dressed as concern. Have you spoken to him since? Are you open to counsel? Do you think you might be reacting out of hurt? One woman, someone I'd admired, lowered her voice and said, You know men struggle differently. I nodded. Not because I agreed. Because I was learning how people reveal themselves when you stop protecting their comfort. By midweek, the sympathy thinned. It was replaced by curiosity. Then judgment. Someone leaked just enough truth to make it ugly without making it clear. Words like misunderstanding and emotional began to orbit my name. Eli, I heard, was taking time to heal. I was refusing peace. He was absent, but graciously so. I was present, and therefore problematic. A message arrived from the church leadership requesting a meeting to bring clarity and unity. Unity, I learned, meant resolution without accountability. In that meeting, I was asked if I had considered how my decision affected Eli's ministry. If I understood the weight of my influence as a woman. If I was willing to walk this journey quietly. Quietly. I thought of the notebook. Of Ruth. Of all the women who had been told to wait on clarity while he perfected his image. I won't lie for unity, I said. The room cooled instantly. One of them sighed. Amani, bitterness can disguise itself as discernment. That sentence followed me home. Online, the story took on a life of its own. Not posts, no one was that bold, but absences. Uninvited spaces. Group chats that went quiet when I entered. I became a lesson. This is what happens when you don't forgive quickly. This is what happens when you speak. The worst part wasn't losing people. It was realizing how many of them had only loved the version of me that didn't make them uncomfortable. One evening, Nyla found me scrolling through messages I hadn't responded to. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "I think so." And I was, just not in the way they expected. Because beneath the grief, beneath the isolation, something else had taken root. Certainty. Not about God's plans. Not about the future. But about myself. I knew now what it cost to tell the truth. And I knew what it cost to stay silent. Only one of those prices was survivable. I set my phone down and looked out the window as dusk settled over the city. They could keep their version of peace. I was done trading my sanity for our comfort. The noise didn't stop all at once. It faded unevenly, like a storm moving away in pieces. Some people disappeared immediately. Others lingered, waiting to see if I would soften, if time would return me to something easier to manage. I stopped explaining. That was the first choice I made that felt like mine. I woke earlier than usual, not from anxiety, but from restlessness, a need to move my body through space that wasn't watching me. I took long walks through unfamiliar streets, learned the names of cafes where no one knew my story, let my thoughts come without trying to correct them. I prayed differently now, not for restoration, not for answers, for clarity, for courage, for the ability to stay with myself when things got quiet. I realized how much of my faith had been performative, not for God, but for people who measured holiness by how little trouble you caused. Alone, my prayers were messier, less articulate, more honest. Sometimes I didn't pray at all, and the world didn't collapse. I packed away the wedding dress one afternoon, folding it carefully into its garment bag. I didn't cry. I didn't burn it or give it away in some symbolic act of freedom. I just acknowledged it for what it was. A life I had almost mistaken for obedience. I kept the notebook too, not out of bitterness, but because it reminded me that truth exists even when it's inconvenient. I didn't reread it often. I didn't need to. Its weight was enough. Nyla asked me once if I hated him. I thought about it before answering. No, I said, but I don't miss who I was becoming with him. That felt like the truest thing I had said in weeks. I began saying no, to meetings, to explanations, to invitations framed as interventions. Each refusal steadied me. Each boundary felt awkward and unfamiliar, like writing with my non-dominant hand, but it was mine. The church stopped calling. Not dramatically, just gradually. I found a different congregation months later, smaller, quieter, uninterested in managing my story. No one asked me to share my testimony. No one needed me to be an example. I sat in the back and learned how to listen again. There were still moments when grief caught me off guard, when a song played, or I passed a venue that looked like a wedding hall. Loss doesn't ask permission before it visits. But it didn't own me anymore. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror and noticed something strange. My shoulders were relaxed. I hadn't realized how long they'd been braced. I smiled, not wide, not triumphant, just enough to recognize myself. I wasn't healed, but I was whole in a way I had never been before. Because for the first time, I wasn't asking who I needed to be chosen. I was asking who I was when I chose myself. And that answer, still forming, still fragile, was already more honest than the life I had almost lived. Redemption didn't arrive as forgiveness. That surprised me. I had been taught that healing meant release, that one day I would wake up ready to let it all go, to bless what broke me, to smile at the lesson and move on lighter. Instead, redemption came as authority. It came the day a woman sat beside me after service and whispered, "Can I ask you something?" Her hands shook when she spoke. She told me she had ended an engagement quietly. No scandal, no proof anyone would believe. Just a gnawing sense that something was wrong and a community that kept telling her doubt was disobedience. "I don't know if I'm crazy," she said. Something steady rose in me. "You're not," I replied, and meant it without qualification. That was the moment I understood what had been returned to me. My voice. Not the polished one. Not the accommodating one. The true one. The kind that doesn't rush to make itself palatable. Word spread slowly. Not gossip, recognition. Women found me in hallways, sent messages late at night, sat across from me with stories they'd never said out loud because they'd learned silence young and thoroughly. I didn't fix them. I didn't spiritualize their pain. I listened. And when necessary, I said the thing no one had said to me soon enough. This is not your fault. Love does not require erasure. God does not demand your disappearance. One evening, months later, I received another message from Ruth. I left it read, "Not just him. The church. I wanted you to know." I sat with that for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. Redemption, I was learning, wasn't about reclaiming what was taken. It was about ending the cycle. Eli tried to reach me once more. A long message. Apologetic in tone, vague in substance. He spoke about growth, about regret, about how things had gotten away from him. I read it once. Then I archived it. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer decided anything. The most unexpected change came quietly. I trusted myself. When discomfort surfaced, I didn't rush to bury it under prayer points or patience. I sat with it, asked questions, let it lead me instead of correcting it. I learned that discernment isn't loud. It's consistent. One morning, I stood by the window watching the city wake up and realized something that made my chest ache. Not with sorrow, but with awe. I had been saved. Not by intervention, not by reconciliation, but by interruption. The wedding that never happened had not been stolen from me. It had been withheld. And in its place, something sturdier had formed. A woman who could stand in truth without needing permission. A faith that did not require her to bleed quietly. A life that belonged to her fully. I didn't know what love would look like next, but I knew this. If it came, it would not ask me to disappear to prove I deserved it. And that knowledge, hard-won, costly, irreversible, was my redemption. I used to think the loudest moments defined a life. The wedding that didn't happen. The public fallout. The way people whispered my name like it carried a warning. But years later, what stands out is the ordinary. Mornings where I wake without bracing myself. Conversations that don't require translation. Silence that feels like rest instead of punishment. I no longer live with Nyla. We still laugh the same, still know each other's tells, but life has expanded us into different rhythms. I live alone now, not because I had to learn independence, but because I like the sound of my own peace. On my bookshelf sits a thin folder. I never opened it again. I don't need to. It holds proof of a version of my life that ended before it could harden into regret. Sometimes people still ask about him. I answer simply, we didn't get married. I don't add anything else. The women keep coming. Some for clarity, some for courage, some just to sit beside someone who didn't choose the easier story. I never sought a platform, but somehow a small circle formed. Living rooms, borrowed church halls, online spaces where honesty was not treated as rebellion. We speak about discernment, about obedience that doesn't cost your selfhood, about faith that makes room for truth instead of fear. I don't lead like I was taught to. I lead like someone who survived being ignored by herself and refuses to let that happen to anyone else. Once, while walking home at dusk, I passed a bridal shop. Dresses floated behind glass, white and hopeful. I stopped, not with grief, but with gratitude. I touched the window lightly. Not goodbye. Thank you. For the interruption. For the escape disguised as loss. For the woman I met on the other side. I kept walking. And this time, there was no part of me left behind. If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. Like the video, so it reaches the woman who needs to hear it next. Subscribe if you want more conversations like this, slow, honest, and rooted in faith. And if this reminded you of someone who's quietly struggling, share it with her. Sometimes one story is enough to help someone choose peace.